Hello and welcome to the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is probably one of the most unknown systems to students. A lot of times they have some background knowledge or a general idea of what the heart does for the cardiovascular system, the lungs, the brain, but a very less familiar but incredibly important system of your body. It's kind of like the unsung hero. It's needed for the cardiovascular system and the immune system to function properly. What it is the lymphatic system. So your body would be unable to maintain fluid balance, which would lead to severe swelling from accumulation of fluids in your body tissues. Your immune system would be compromised and infection would inevitably take over. A little fun fact is that the body actually harbors at least 10 times as many bacterial cells as human cells. And we're 30 trillion cells. So that's a lot of bacteria cells. Some of these cells are beneficial and some of them are potentially disease causing. Some of them even are opportunists, so they won't cause disease unless they have an opportunity to do so. Well, your immune system takes care of these bad guys, these bad bacteria. And your immune system, it isn't really an organ system, but it's actually more of a population of cells that are found in all of our body organs. These cells are typically clumped together, for example, in the pancreas, but they're more of a cell population. The actual organ system is called the lymphatic system, and it is a network of organs and vein-like vessels that recover fluid from the cardiovascular system, and then they inspect that fluid and look for disease-causing pathogens or hormones. They will activate an immune response if needed, and fluid will get returned back to the bloodstream. So if we recall from the cardiovascular unit, blood will go into tissue spaces and fluid will be continually filtered from those blood capillaries into the tissue spaces. And about 85% of the blood or fluid will be reabsorbed through those blood capillaries, which means about 15%, which is approximately 2 to 4 liters a day of the water, and only about half of the plasma proteins will enter into the lymphatic system. That's what we had mentioned in the cardiovascular system. And then once they go through the lymphatic system, they'll be returned to the blood. So now that's what we're going to talk about. So at our capillaries, fluid and some of those proteins are leaked from the plasma from our arteries. And in one day, there's about 20 liters of fluid that will leak into our tissues in this way. That's equivalent to 10 2-liter soda bottles. And for reference, our blood volume is between 5 to 6 liters on average. So if we didn't reabsorb this leaked fluid, our blood volume would drop dramatically and blood pressure would absolutely tank. 17 of the 20 liters that have been leaked are reabsorbed by the veins and the capillaries, but there's that 15%, which ends up being about 3 liters that are not. And these 3 liters become the role of the lymphatic system. And 3 liters of fluid is about half of your total blood volume, 5 to 6 liters. So the lymphatic system has an extremely important job. And note, remember that arteries go away from the heart and veins go to the heart. But lymphatic vessels only go to the heart to return this fluid. So to truly see the importance of the system, let's check out a disorder in which the condition does not properly do its job. So lipidemia is a condition that causes swelling in the body due to a buildup of lymph fluid. This typically occurs due to a blockage within the lymphatic system. Lymph fluid cannot properly drain, and the buildup of fluid in the tissues causes swelling and inflammation. In addition to its role in maintaining water balance in your body, the lymphatic system also plays a vital role in the immune system. And we're going to look at some of those cells as well. The lymphatic system supports and stores the lymphocytes in lymph nodes and in other lymphatic organs. So lymph is a clear or white fluid that contains water, but it also contains lymphocytes, which are white blood cells, proteins, minerals, some fats. It will also have damaged cells, cancer cells, and pathogens. This fluid is only called lymph when it is inside our lymphatic vessels. So it's similar to plasma of blood, but there's much less protein. And it originates as extracellular fluid drawn into the lymphatic capillaries. The chemical composition is going to vary in places. So for example, intestinal lymph will have much more nutrients and macromolecules like amino acids and sugars, or versus after a lymph node. Those chemical compositions will vary. But this extracellular fluid, it will trap, once it gets into the lymphatic vessels, it will travel through those lymphatic vessels, which are similar to blood vessels. If you look at the picture, you can see and recall from the cardiovascular system, we have these arteries that go away from the heart, and then you have veins that go toward the heart. And then here we have the lymphatic vessels that are added in green. The lymphatic vessels are only going to go towards the heart to deliver lymph fluid back to it. The lymphatic system and the cardiovascular system work together in this way, but they are still separate systems. And in this picture, you can see that the lymphatic capillary surrounds the blood capillary. So fluid will diffuse out of these capillaries and into the surrounding tissue. And then it will collect in these tissues. And it will kind of leak its way into the, here's the arrow, into the lymphatic capillary. Lymphatic capillaries will lead to larger lymphatic vessels, which bring lymph fluid back to the bloodstream and back to the heart. Lymphatic vessels are what will transport lymph towards the heart, And they're made out of, they're very similar to veins, but they're just slightly different. So they're made out of the same layers of veins. They're going to have the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. And that tunica interna is going to be made out of a very thin endothelium that fluid passes through easily to enter, and they're very permeable. And they're also going to have these valves that can open and close due to pressure inside of the lymph vessel. They're going to have a tunica media that has elastic fibers and a smooth muscle layer. The tunica media will have that smooth muscle in it, so when the smooth muscle contracts, it will actually help move any lymphatic fluid through the vessel and back towards the heart. And then it will have the external layer, which is the tunica externa, which is the thin outer layer. But these layers are much, much thinner than in the veins. And there are also going to be these mini valves. And so the mini valves, which are shown here, these mini valves will open when the pressure of the fluid in the tissues around them is really high. That's going to drive that fluid into this lymphatic vessel. So they're kind of like sponges, and they're going to just soak up any extra fluid. So here we have a picture, and what you can notice is the mini valves. And as fluid is pushed into the vessel here and here through that intercellular cleft, that vessel is going to start to fill with now lymph fluid. And as that vessel fills with lymph fluid, that's going to put pressure on these valves, and it's going to close those valves, preventing the fluid from leaking back out. We're also going to have some anchoring filaments which are attached, and this helps to make sure that the lymph capillaries stay where it's supposed to. So the walls of that endothelial layer here, the walls overlap to form these flap-like mini valves. And that's an overlapping of those epithelial cells. And fluid will leak into the lymph capillaries. And those lymph capillaries are going to be anchored to connective tissue by filaments. And when there's higher pressure inside of the lymphatic vessel, that's going to close these mini valves. And the fluid will be forced along the vessel. And those valves within the lymphatic vessels will prevent the backflow of the fluid, so it continues to go in one direction towards the heart. So the lymph fluid moving through the lymph vessel, it doesn't have a pump like the cardiovascular system has the heart that will actively pump and push the blood. Well, lymph doesn't have a pump like that. Instead, the surrounding skeletal muscles will provide pressure anytime those skeletal muscles contract. And it'll be kind of like a milking action that pulls the lymph through the fluid. There is also that tunica media layer that has smooth muscle inside of it. So when that smooth muscle contracts, there's a rhythmic contraction that will push the lymph through and help it move along. And then it will have those valves close that will prevent the backflow of the lymphatic fluid. And here you can actually see the microscopic image of the lymph vessel. And you can see that it looks very different than a vein, because with the vein, you can actually see more of the wall. Here, it's very, very thin. And when we look at the valve here, you can see that these valves are positioned to prevent the backflow. Some of the main components of the lymphatic system include lymph nodes, and we reference lymph nodes and then nobody really talks about a lymph node. So we have about 600 to 700 lymph nodes along our lymphatic vessels. And what lymph nodes are they are these little bean-shaped clusters throughout the lymphatic system that are going to serve as checkpoints. And due to wounds or infection, lymph contains, or it can contain, pathogens like bacteria, viruses, and more. We do not want these things, these pathogens, to get into the blood, because that could cause a body-wide sepsis or fatal infection. So the fluid will have foreign cells in it, waste products from tissues, toxins, bacteria, etc. And as fluid travels through them, the white blood cells that are inside of them, like macrophages and natural killer cells and T cells and B cells, will start to inspect it for anything that needs to be destroyed. And then it's going to filter it, and if needed, it will mount an immune response. And so lymph nodes contain immune cells called lymphocytes, like B cells or T cells, as well as those macrophages. And that can elicit an immune response. And this should make sense with the way our body works, because when the body has an infection, these lymph nodes will start to swell with white blood cells coming to fight that infection. This is why your lymph nodes swell when you're sick, and why doctors will check your lymph nodes to detect if there is an infection. So the lymph vessels will carry lymph to the lymph nodes. And these lymph nodes are surrounded by a capsule. And that capsule is made up of connective tissue. And then there will be these reticular fibers that form the structure within the lymph node. And those reticular fibers are referred to as trabeculae. And if you remember, trabeculae means little beams, and that's what actually forms the spongy appearance of spongy bone. And so these are going to be very similar in structure. They're going to be these little bean-like structures that actually form the lymph node. And inside of the lymph node, there will be germinal centers. And so remember, when something is referred to as germinal, that's where a lot of mitosis and cells are being made. So at this germinal center, there are immune cells that are going to be made very, very quickly. So that way, if there is an invader found in the lymph, they can be made very quickly to start to fight off that infection. So this is the pathway through the lymphatic vessels once that lymph is on its way towards the heart. And remember, there is no pump. So along the way, lymph will pass through those lymph nodes. And lymphatic capillaries are very, very, very small. and they're really narrow. And these lymphatic capillaries are going to be interwoven with the cardiovascular system capillaries. But these lymphatic capillaries are highly permeable, meaning that extracellular fluid will very easily be able to pass through those intercellular clefts and into that lymphatic vessel as long as the pressure is low. So these capillaries are the first site where lymph is absorbed into the lymphatic system. And these capillaries will pass to larger collecting lymphatic vessels. The collecting vessels will pass lymph to larger lymph trunks. And then the lymph trunks will pass into two lymphatic ducts. There is the right lymphatic duct, and as much as I would love to say the left lymphatic duct, it's not. It's called the thoracic duct. And then these two ducts will dump lymph into two veins that are near the heart. It's actually the subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein. The heart pumps blood through the blood vessels, and what pumps lymph through the lymphatic vessels? Lymph moves through these lymphatic vessels due to that smooth muscle in their walls. Lymph also is pushed to the movements due to the movements of skeletal muscles around the vessels, and pressure changes in the chest cavity while inhaling and exhaling. Lastly, blood vessels are usually next to lymphatic vessels, and their pulsations will also cause lymph to flow. There is a very close association between the lymphatic vessels and capillaries and the circulatory lymph vessels and capillaries. And so blood capillaries will lose fluid to the tissue spaces. And then the lymphatic vessels will pick up any excess tissue fluid and return it back to the bloodstream. So take a second to try to think of some benefits in having lymphatic capillaries pick up this tissue fluid that's not being reclaimed by blood capillaries. If you need another minute, pause it, because the answer is it's going to prevent excess fluid accumulation and will also allow for a monitoring of tissue fluids for pathogens. Lymphatic vessels will converge to form collecting vessels, and these often travel alongside veins and arteries and will share common connective tissue. At irregular intervals, they will empty into lymph nodes, and the lymph trickles slowly through each node, and it will leave the other side of the node through another collecting vessel, traveling on and often encountering additional lymph nodes before finally being returned to the bloodstream. Eventually, the collecting vessels will converge to form larger lymphatic trunk, and each will drain a major portion of the body, and there are 11 of these. The lymphatic trunks will converge to form two collecting ducts, the largest of the lymphatic vessels. There's the right lymphatic duct, and that will have the convergence of the right jugular, the subclavian, the bronchiomediastinal trunks in the right thoracic cavity, and it will receive drainage from the head, brain, the right arm, and the right side of the thorax, and it will empty into the right subclavian vein. while the thoracic duct is on the left side and it's larger and longer. It begins just below the diaphragm, anterior to the vertebral column, and at the level of the second lumbar vertebrae. If you look at the guy in the lower right, everything in purple is what the right lymphatic duct collects. But below the diaphragm is collected by the thoracic duct. So it is not bilateral. So when lymph is flowing, it's going to flow under the same types of rules as venous return. So there is no pump, and there are going to be valves, and the flow will be moving at a very low pressure. And so it's also going to move at a slower speed. And what's going to move this lymph is these rhythmatic contractions in the tunica media of the lymphatic vessel. When there is a stretching of the vessel from accumulation of lymph, that will stimulate the contraction, and there will also be movement of skeletal muscles around that lymphatic vessel that will squeeze like a milking action, moving the lymph throughout the vessels. So as the blood is being pushed through the arteries, remember arterial blood flow does have a pump, and that artery is very close to the capillary. So that arterial pulsation will also help squeeze these lymphatic vessels. The thoracic pump, if you think about the thoracic cavity, the diaphragm is a muscle, and every time we inhale and we exhale, there is a squeezing action within the thoracic cavity. That's going to aid flow from the abdomen to the thoracic cavity. And then there are going to be those valves that will prevent the backflow. And when we look at the location of the subclavian veins, the subclavian veins are rapidly flowing, bringing blood back to the heart. And so that rapid flowing of blood in the subclavian veins will actually draw lymph into those subclavian veins. So that way it can be returned to the blood. And if we exercise, that movement and motion and contraction of all of our skeletal muscles will significantly increase lymphatic return. So when lymph enters into these lymph nodes, those are referred to as afferent vessels. And when they leave through efferent vessels. So very, very similar to our cardiovascular system. This will also help slow down the lymph so that way it can be filtered through that lymph node, giving those cells time to start to digest any foreign material that needs to be broken down. So let's look anatomically. We're going to look at the right side of the diagram. And it shows you the right jugular trunk, the right subclavian, and the right bronchial mediastinal. So remember, bronchial is lungs, mediastinum is the medial portion of the thoracic cavity. So we have those three that are going to come together to the right lymphatic duct, which is then going to go into the right subclavian vein. Now, if we look at the left side, we're going to go down to the bottom where we see the intestinal trunk and the left lumbar trunk. Well, those and over here, the right lumbar trunk are all going to go into that cisternal chyli, which is the enlarged sac-like bulge here. And that is going to collect everything from below the diaphragm, and then it will head up to the left subclavian vein. It's going, and as it heads towards that left subclavian vein, it's going to collect from the intercostals, the left bronchiomedial stamen, the left jugular, left subclavian, and all of those guys are going to come together. As it travels through the thorax, it's called the thoracic duct, and it's going to be the final collecting portion that will then go into the left subclavian vein. Whenever we study lymphatics, there is always an image of breast tissue, and that's because there is an extensive lymphatic system and network of these vessels through mammary glands. Many lymphatics and lymph nodes are going through the breast tissue. And so if you think about breast cancer and how it metastasizes and spreads so quickly, well, the reason it can spread so quickly is because what can happen in breast cancer is that the cancer cells will drop off into the lymphatic system, and then they will again get into the bloodstream. So many times when people are first diagnosed, they will collect one of these axillary lymph nodes and look to see if the cancer cells have already gotten into the lymphatic system and have metastasized. All right, so these lymph vessels will all eventually converge and form the lymphatic trunks. And there are 11 total. So there are 6 lymphatic trunks in total that will drain the major portions of the body. And they're named for the portion that they drain. And they are all going to have pairs except for the intestinal. Notice how that says unpaired. So there is the jugular, the subclavian, the bronchiomedial sternum, the intercostal, the intestinal, and the lumbar trunks. And make note of the location of the cisternal chyli. This is where the right and the left lumbar trunk and your intestinal trunk, those 3 trunks, will all come together. And then there are those 2 major collecting ducts that I talked about earlier. The right lymphatic duct that will receive lymph from the right arm, the right side of the head, and the thorax that will empty into the right subclavian vein, and the larger and longer thoracic duct that will begin as a prominent sac, that cisternal chyli, and that will receive lymph from below the diaphragm, the left arm, the left side of the head, the neck, and thorax, which will empty into the subclavian vein. Some additional components of the lymphatic system include your largest lymphoid organ, known as the spleen. It's a soft organ that's very rich in blood. It's approximately the size of your fist, and it's located in the upper left quadrant of the body, specifically in the left hypochondriac region of the abdomen. It's located under your stomach, and it has many other functions. So the function we're going to focus on is its function to increase the number of lymphocytes, specifically B cells and T cells. The spleen cleans our blood by removing old red blood cells and platelets. Macrophages in the spleen will eliminate debris and other foreign matter. It also helps to recycle the components of dead red blood cells, And there's even more, which we may talk about later. MALT stands for mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues. So the entry points to our bodies are lined with mucous membranes, like your nose, mouth, throat, the digestive tract. These entry points are also places that are easy targets for bacteria, viruses, fungus, and other pathogens to get into our body. So to fortify our weak points, malt is built into the mucous membranes. For example, the tonsils line the pharynx. The appendix and Peyer's patches defend the intestines. Malt is also found in the mucous membranes of the respiratory tract, genital tracts, urinary tract, and the rest of the digestive tract. There are many different tonsils named for their location. For example, the palatine tonsils, the lingual tonsils, the pharyngeal tonsils, tubal tonsils. Well, the tonsils collect pathogens and remove them, preventing them from entering the lungs or digestive tract. The tonsils have these pits or crypts that trap bacteria and other particles where they are then destroyed. The bacteria go deep into the tonsils, which is why we get a sore throat when we're sick, for example, like strep. The Peyer's patches, these are large clusters of lymphoid tissue, and it's actually located in the distal portion of the small intestines. The apex is a small finger-shaped organ that comes off the beginning of the large intestines, and it does have a purpose. In fact, we believe it has multiple. In the immune system, the appendix prevents bacteria, which are abundant in the intestines, from passing through the intestinal wall and causing infection. We will talk more about these when we get to the intestines, but there are specialized lymphatic vessels that any dietary fat will be absorbed through these specialized lymphatic vessels. So when you eat lipids or fat in your diet, it does not actually go directly into your bloodstream right away. Like proteins, you eat proteins, they'll get broken down into those amino acids, and sugars will get broken down into a monosaccharide or a single molecule of glucose, and those will actually go directly into your bloodstream. But lipids in your diet will actually go through lymphatic vessels first before they get returned to the bloodstream. So a function of the lymphatic system is to absorb dietary lipids. And we will pause it here and we'll talk about lymphatic cells coming up next.